She followed her husband on their anniversary. What she saw through that cracked motel door didn't just break her heart, it shattered everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the life she had carefully built. This is Imara Hayes' story, and it begins the way all great betrayals do, on the most beautiful morning imaginable. Iowa in summer is something people from the coasts never quite understand. It isn't loud or flashy. It doesn't try to impress you. It just stretches out wide and golden and endless, cornfields swaying in a warm breeze like they've got all the time in the world. For Imara, a black artist who had grown up in this overwhelmingly white, quietly breathtaking state, those fields weren't just scenery, they were home. They were the backdrop of every memory she carried. The Iowa State Fair with her parents, the carnival lights cutting through the summer dark, the feeling of being completely alive in a place that sometimes made her fight just to be seen. Imara had learned early that existing as a black woman in Iowa was, as she once described it, a radical act of self-love. She hadn't just survived here. She had bloomed here. She had found her voice through painting and sculpture, built a community in the Des Moines art scene, and earned herself a spot at the downtown festival. This was her world, and she had built it with her own two hands. And she had built it, she believed, alongside the man she loved. Malik had been her person since college, the kind of love that starts with long conversations and cheap coffee, and grows into something you stop questioning, because questioning it feels like doubting gravity. By the time they married, they were certain, the way young people in love are always certain, that what they had was unbreakable. 5 years later, they were living on a modest Iowa farmstead, dreaming of opening a small gallery together, spending quiet evenings under an old oak tree counting stars and making plans. Simple plans, beautiful plans, the kind that feel like they'll last forever because you can't imagine a version of your life where they don't. So, on the morning of their 5th anniversary, Imara woke up early and got to work, making forever feel a little more special. She made pancakes. She brewed coffee. She hung a banner above the kitchen window where the cornfields rolled all the way to the horizon, and she slipped into the red dress, the one Malik had always said brought out her eyes. Every small gesture was an act of love. Every detail, a quiet declaration. The morning smelled like warmth and promise, and Imara allowed herself to feel it fully, to stand inside that happiness without flinching. But here's what the beautiful mornings never tell you about themselves. They don't warn you, they just shine. Because for the past month, something had been quietly, steadily wrong. Malik had been coming home late. His excuses were thin. Dinner ran long, got stuck with clients, words that sat in the air between them like smoke without a fire. He'd stopped calling as often. The way he looked at her had shifted in some small, unnameable way. And sometimes, while she cooked dinner alone, she'd catch him glancing at his phone and looking away just a half-second too fast. Imara told herself she was anxious. She told herself she was reading into nothing. She told herself, the way so many of us do when the truth is too heavy to hold, that everything was fine. And then Malik walked into the kitchen, kissed her cheek, and told her he had to swing by the clinic for a quick meeting. His voice had a tremor in it she almost didn't catch. Almost. He grabbed his keys, leaned in for one more kiss, said happy anniversary, and he was gone. For a moment, Imara stood there in her red dress in her sunlit kitchen and let herself wonder if maybe he was planning a surprise. Maybe the meeting was a cover story. Maybe love was still exactly what she thought it was. But something else was already moving inside her. Something older than hope. Something that had been quietly collecting evidence for 30 days and had finally decided it was done being ignored. Her fingers closed around her car keys. She followed him. Through the rolling fields, under a blazing Iowa sunset, she kept his taillights in sight, her palms damp on the steering wheel, her heart hammering in a rhythm that felt less like fear and more like grief that hadn't announced itself yet. She told herself it was innocent. She told herself she would feel foolish in 10 minutes. She told herself a lot of things on that drive. And then he turned off the highway and pulled into a roadside motel parking lot. She parked. She got out. She walked toward the dingy hallway on legs that somehow kept moving. And just as she reached it, the door to room 12 cracked open, and through that narrow slice of light, Imara Hayes saw the truth that her heart had been trying to protect her from for an entire month. Malik, and a woman, her hands on his chest, their lips meeting, softly at first, and then not softly at all. And the woman's face, when it turned slightly toward the light. It was Layla Morgan, his office manager. A woman Imara had welcomed into her own home. A woman she had called a friend. The door clicked shut. Imara turned and walked back to her car without making a single sound. Now here's what I need you to sit with, because this is the question at the center of everything that comes next. When a woman survives a betrayal this devastating, rebuilds herself from nothing, learns to trust again, and dares to open her heart one more time. What happens when the universe hands her the exact same knife, held by a different hand? There is a particular kind of silence that follows the worst moments of your life. Not the comfortable silence of a quiet evening, or the peaceful silence of a sleeping house. This is a different animal entirely. This is the silence that fills your ears like water when the world as you knew it has just collapsed beneath your feet, and your body hasn't yet decided what to do with the rubble. That was the silence inside Imara Hayes' car as she drove away from that motel parking lot. She didn't scream. She didn't call anyone. She didn't turn the car around and pound on the door of room 12 and demand answers she already had. She just drove, through the golden Iowa fields turning dark under a fading sunset, past the cornfields that had always made her feel at home, past the landmarks of a life that had just been quietly, permanently altered. Her hands stayed steady on the wheel, her face stayed dry, and somewhere deep inside the chest of this woman who had spent her whole life learning how to take up space in a world that sometimes forgot she was there, something very old and very strong was already beginning to do the math. The marriage was over. She knew it the way you know certain things, not with your mind, but with your whole body. The way you know a storm is coming before the clouds arrive. The way you know a fire has reached a wall before you see the smoke. Imara Hayes had followed her husband to a roadside motel on their 5th wedding anniversary, and she had watched him kiss another woman through a cracked door, and now she was driving home in a red dress with a wedding band on her finger that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's life. And yet, she was calm, devastatingly, eerily calm. She pulled into the driveway of their farmhouse and sat in the dark for a long moment. The kitchen window still glowed warm from inside. She could see the anniversary banner she had hung that morning, its cheerful letters reading "Happy Anniversary" above the horizon of a life she had cooked breakfast for, dressed up for, believed in. She looked at it for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she got out of the car, walked to the porch, sat down on the swing, and she waited. Think about what that takes. Think about what it costs a person to sit in that kind of stillness, holding a truth that heavy without letting it spill. Because Imara didn't pace. She didn't rehearse a speech. She didn't call Tamika or her mother or anyone who might have talked her through it or talked her out of it. She just sat in the dark Iowa night with the warm breeze moving through the fields and the distant sound of crickets, and she waited for her husband to come home. Malik arrived later that evening. He was still in his suit, a deep crease across his forehead, and he wore the particular expression of a man who has been rehearsing an explanation the entire drive home and still isn't sure it's going to work. He saw her on the porch swing and slowed. He softly said he was sorry. He tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding. He reached for the vocabulary of innocence that cheating partners had been reaching for since the beginning of time. Words like complicated and nothing serious, and I didn't mean for this to happen. Imara looked at him, quietly, completely. The way you look at something you are memorizing for the last time. And then she said 4 words. "This is over." Malik's face went the color of ash. He took a step back as if the words had a physical weight to them. And maybe they did, because those 4 words weren't said in anger, and that's what made them so final. There was no heat in them, no trembling fury, no mascara-streaked ultimatum. Just the quiet, devastating authority of a woman who had already done her grieving on the drive home and arrived on the other side of it with absolute clarity. By morning, they had a lawyer. Within a week, they were legal strangers. The ring came off her finger on a Tuesday afternoon. set on the dresser with a soft click that no one else heard. And in that small sound, that tiny anticlimactic sound, a chapter of Imara Hayes' life officially ended. But here's what they never tell you about endings. They don't arrive clean. They don't close the door behind them. They leave a mess, and then they leave you alone in it. The farmhouse, that had always felt like a home, now felt like an exhibit. Every corner held evidence of a life she was no longer living. The coffee mug Malik always used. The oak tree outside the window where they used to sit and plan their future. The half-finished sketch for the gallery they had talked about opening someday. Imara moved through these spaces, like a woman navigating a museum of her own grief. And some nights the weight of it was so complete that she couldn't tell where the sadness ended and she began. She painted. That was how she survived it. She threw herself into her art with the desperation of someone using creation to outrun destruction, and the work that came out of those first brutal months was some of the rawest, most honest work she had ever made. Storms, fractured shapes, colors so dark they seemed to absorb the light around them. She painted anger she couldn't speak, and grief she couldn't name, and questions she couldn't stop asking in the middle of the night. Some mornings she woke with paint still under her fingernails from the night before, and no memory of stopping. She told herself she would never love again. And in those early months, she believed it. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical certainty of someone who wants to be talked out of it, but with the quiet, bone-deep conviction of a woman who had looked at love and decided the math didn't work in her favor. She had given everything. She had built a life. She had worn the red dress and hung the banner and made the pancakes and trusted, completely, fully, without reservation, and it had still come apart in her hands. So what was the point? What was the use of opening yourself up like that, making yourself that vulnerable, only to find out that the person you trusted most had been slowly, carefully, choosing someone else? Ask yourself something right now. Have you ever been so thoroughly betrayed by someone you loved that you didn't just lose them? You lost your own judgment. You lost your confidence in your ability to read people, to trust your instincts, to believe in what you thought you knew, because that is a particular kind of damage. It doesn't just break your heart, it breaks your compass. And a woman without a compass, moving through a life that suddenly makes no sense, that is a woman in real danger of disappearing entirely. But Imara Hayes was not built to disappear. Slowly, not quickly, not dramatically, not in any of the ways movies make healing look, slowly, the darkness began to shift. Her friend Tamika showed up one cold evening with soup and a stubbornness that refused to take silence for an answer. She dragged Imara to a jazz night downtown, and something happened under those neon lights that no one could have. Predicted, Imara danced. Awkwardly at first, self-consciously, the way you move when you've forgotten that your body is allowed to feel good. And then, less awkwardly. And then freely. And in that crowded, warm, music-filled room, surrounded by people who had no idea what she had been through, Imara felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt alive. She threw herself into new things with the deliberate energy of someone rebuilding an identity from the foundation up. Pottery classes at the community center, her hands working wet clay into shapes that were imperfect and real. A ceramic workshop at the Iowa Historical Museum. Morning runs through the gold-lit fields, each step painful in the beginning, then less painful, then almost something that felt like joy. She sold a painting called Phoenix, about rising from ashes, and the buyer told her he could see the hope in it. Imara looked at the painting for a long time after he said that, and then she allowed herself to believe that maybe he was right. Maybe she was rising. Maybe the ashes weren't all there was. She was not healed, but she was rising. And that was precisely when Miles Parker walked into her life. It was a gallery night at the Des Moines Art Center. Imara was standing near her piece, a large canvas she had titled Resilience, when she became aware of a presence behind her, the kind of awareness you have when someone is looking at something with real attention rather than polite interest. She turned, and there he was, tall, broad-shouldered, white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the kind of easy confidence that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. He had an open, curious face and eyes that were doing something rare in an art gallery. They were actually looking, not performing looking, not pretending to be moved while secretly checking the price tags, actually, genuinely looking. At her work, at the painting she had poured her survival into. When he realized she was standing there, his face shifted into a warm, slightly surprised smile. He extended his hand. "You're Imara Hayes," he said. "Your work is incredible. It speaks to me. Now, compliments at gallery nights are currency. They're exchanged freely and often mean very little." But the way Miles Parker said those words was different. There was no performance in it, no networking calculation. He asked what inspired the painting, and something in the way he leaned in and listened, really listened, the way people used to before everyone started waiting for their turn to talk, made Imara find herself telling him things. Not everything, but enough. Enough for him to understand that the woman who had made this painting had come through something real. He asked for coffee. She said yes, and a door that Imara had believed was permanently closed cracked open just an inch. Miles Parker was, in almost every measurable way, the opposite of what she expected. He was white, from a prominent Des Moines family, a man who had grown up on a farm outside Ames and climbed his way through corporate ranks before striking out on his own to run a consulting firm with 50 employees. His world was business dinners and country club galas, and the particular vocabulary of ambitious, successful Iowa men who built things and were proud of it. On the surface, he and Imara had almost nothing in common. But here is the thing about connection. It doesn't read resumes. Over coffee, they talked about their childhoods, her family's farm, his big red barn house with his siblings tumbling through it. They laughed about their Iowa accents and teased each other about the gaps in their cultural references. He didn't understand her favorite folk songs. She had strong opinions about his devotion to classic rock. He was curious about her world, genuinely, endearingly curious, in the way that people are when they've never been invited somewhere before and are grateful just to be at the door. And Imara, who had spent her whole life being the person who had to explain herself, found that explaining herself to Miles Parker felt surprisingly easy. Within weeks, they were spending every evening together. He would come over to her farmhouse and she would cook, and he would pour wine, and they would sit at the kitchen table and talk until the night ran out. One weekend he surprised her with a sunset picnic by the river, fried chicken, potato salad, strawberries, a blanket spread over the grass while the clouds turned pink above them. She brought a blanket, and they lay there, holding hands, looking at the sky like the world had nowhere more important to be. He learned her slang. She learned to appreciate his quiet humor. He introduced her to his colleagues at business dinners as his partner and a gifted artist, and the way he said it, without qualification, without the awkward pause that sometimes preceded those kinds of introductions, without making it a statement about himself, made something warm and certain move through her. At a gala at the country club, under a chandelier that scattered light across the whole room like something out of a dream, Miles held her close on the dance floor and whispered things in her ear that she hadn't heard in so long she'd almost stopped needing them. And Imara Hayes, this woman who had looked at love and decided the math didn't work, did something extraordinarily brave. She trusted him. "Now, stop here for just a moment, because I need you to understand what that means. I need you to understand the scale of what Imara was doing when she chose to open her heart to Miles Parker. This was not a woman who hadn't been hurt before. This was not someone stepping cautiously into unfamiliar territory. This was a woman who had followed her husband to a motel, who had watched her marriage dissolve in a week, who had spent months rebuilding herself from the ground up, painting her grief and running through cornfields at sunrise and shaping clay with her own 2 hands, just to remember that she still had the ability to make something. And after all of that, she looked at this man and said, with her whole self, "I choose to believe in this." That is not weakness. That is the single most courageous thing a human being can do. And for a while, for a beautiful golden while, it worked. But love, as Imara was learning, has a way of teaching its hardest lessons in the moments when you think you've finally passed the test. It started small, the way these things always do, because the universe, when it decides to deliver a lesson, rarely announces itself loudly. It leaves notes instead, small, easy to dismiss, notes that your instincts read correctly, and your hope immediately shreds. Miles came home from a business trip one evening, smelling of a perfume that wasn't Imara's. She noticed it the way you notice a wrong note in a song you know by heart. Briefly, uncomfortably, immediately explained away. He'd probably hugged a client goodbye. He was probably at a crowded dinner. She folded the observation into a small, neat square and tucked it somewhere she didn't have to look at it. Then there was the collar. A lipstick smear, faint but unmistakable, on the inside of his collar on a morning when he was getting dressed for work. She saw it from across the room. Her stomach moved in a way she recognized, a dropping sensation, like stepping off a curb you didn't see coming. She said nothing. She told herself she was doing it again. She told herself, this was what happened when you'd been hurt. You turned every shadow into a threat. You catastrophized. You took normal, innocent moments and filtered them through a lens of damage until they looked dangerous. She was not going to be that woman. She was not going to punish Miles for what Malik had done to her. So she said nothing, and watched, and noticed, the phone locking, the new driving route, the way he sometimes looked at her a half-beat too long when she asked a simple question, as if he was calculating something behind his eyes. Each thing alone was nothing. Each thing alone was explainable. But Imara Hayes was an artist, and artists see patterns. They see the relationship between shapes. They understand that individual brushstrokes only make sense when you step back and look at the whole canvas. She was stepping back, and she didn't like what she was seeing. She pushed it down. She pushed it down hard and covered it with normalcy, cooked dinners and jazz clubs and conversations that didn't go anywhere near the fear she was carrying. She told herself she loved him. She told herself he loved her. She told herself that the past was the past, and that Miles Parker was not Malik Hayes, and that she had earned something good by surviving what she had survived. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, while they were talking about their upcoming week, Miles mentioned a business trip on Friday, a client dinner. He said it casually, with the specific casualness of someone who has rehearsed being casual, and he added, almost as an afterthought, almost as if it were the most unremarkable information in the world, that a partner would be flying in to help close the deal. A partner named Layla Morgan, he said. The room didn't change. The lighting didn't shift. No thunder rolled across the Iowa sky outside the window. Everything stayed exactly as it was. The dinner plates, the half-filled wine glasses, the soft background hum of the evening. And yet, for Imara Hayes, the entire world had just stopped rotating on its axis. Layla Morgan. She said the name back to him slowly. 2 words. Careful as a surgeon's incision. Layla Morgan. Miles paused. Just briefly. Just a fraction of a second too long. Yeah, he said. She's heading a new marketing campaign for us. His voice had a texture to it that she recognized. The slightly over-explained quality of a statement that is true on the surface and complicated underneath. He seemed uneasy. He moved on quickly. Imara nodded and changed the subject. But inside, every single thing she had been telling herself for weeks had just collapsed into a single, terrible, undeniable shape. Because Layla Morgan was not a common name. And Layla Morgan was not a stranger to Imara Hayes. Layla Morgan was the woman in the doorway of room 12. Layla Morgan was the woman who had put her hands on Malik's chest and kissed him while Imara stood in a dingy hallway in a red dress on her anniversary. Layla Morgan was the reason Imara had taken her ring off on a Tuesday afternoon and set it on a dresser with a click that no one else heard. And now, Layla Morgan was apparently a business associate of the man Imara had chosen to trust with the most fragile, hard-won version of her rebuilt heart. Ask yourself this. What would you do? Genuinely, what would you do in that moment? Would you confront him right there, demands and accusations spilling out over the dinner table? Would you pack a bag? Would you call the whole thing off on the spot, protecting yourself before the hammer could fall? Or would you do what Imara did? Would you fold your terror into something small and quiet, change the subject with a steady voice, and decide that you needed to know the full truth before you burned anything down? Because Imara Hayes had been through this before. And the one thing that experience had taught her, the one upgrade that surviving Malik had installed in her, was that you don't panic before you have the complete picture. You wait. You watch. You let the truth reveal itself fully, because half-truths have a way of being weaponized against you when you try to use them. So she waited. She kissed Miles goodbye when he left for his trip on Friday. She told him she loved him. She watched him walk down the driveway with a spring in his step that she catalogued carefully, the way a detective catalogues evidence. She stood at the window for a moment after his car disappeared, and then she turned and walked back into the house and sat with everything she knew in the particular silence that had become very familiar to her. The longest weekend of her life passed like standing water, still on the surface, turbulent underneath. She painted. She ran. She called Tamika and talked about nothing. She waited. Miles came home on Sunday looking exhausted, in the way that people look exhausted when they have been carrying something heavy rather than when they have simply been working hard. He said the trip was great. He said the deal was finalized, thanks largely to Layla's work on the campaign. He smiled when he said her name, and there was something in that smile, a particular, involuntary warmth, that Imara's body registered before her mind had time to process it. He was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, sunflowers, her favorite. He held them out to her with a tender expression that might have broken her heart completely if her heart hadn't already been doing calculus. She accepted the flowers. She said, "Thank you." She made tea. They sat together on the couch, and Imara pretended to watch television while every nerve in her body stood at attention. His phone was on the coffee table between them. Face up. She wasn't watching it. She was very carefully not watching it. The way you are very carefully not doing something when part of you is absolutely doing it. And then, in the particular silence of a Sunday evening in Iowa, with the television murmuring in the background and sunflowers on the kitchen table, his phone buzzed once. A preview notification appeared on the screen. 4 words and an emoji. That's all it was. 4 words and a small pink mouth and a kiss mark. "Missing you, beautiful." From L. Morgan. The silence in the room didn't change, but everything inside Imara Hayes went completely, perfectly still. The kind of still that comes just before something breaks. She stared at those words on that screen for what felt like a very long time, but was probably less than 3 seconds. Then she pointed at the phone. "What is that?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, not trembling, not accusatory, just quiet. The quiet of a woman who already knows the answer and is giving a man one final opportunity to choose the truth. Miles looked at the screen. The color drained from his face in a way that was almost scientific, visible and immediate, like watching weather change. He took a breath. "It's Layla," he said. "She was there. I told you a bit about it." His voice had come apart at the seams. And that was it. That was the full sentence. That was everything he had. Something detonated inside Imara Hayes. Not loudly. She would not give this moment the dignity of loudness, but completely. Every wall she had carefully rebuilt, every morning run and pottery class and phoenix painting, every brave and terrifying act of trust that had brought her to this couch with these sunflowers and this man, all of it shook at once. Because this wasn't just another betrayal. This was a pattern. This was the universe holding up a mirror and showing her the same picture twice, and the picture had Layla Morgan in it both times. Miles saw it happen. He saw the shift in her face, the specific, terrible clarity of someone arriving at an understanding that cannot be taken back, and something in him broke open. He started to cry. He slid off the couch and landed on his knees on the floor, tears streaming, voice cracking, both hands reaching for something she had already pulled back. "Imara, I love you. It was a mistake, I promise," he said. "Please, please don't leave. I love you. I'll fix it. Tell me how to fix it." She stood up. She looked down at him, this man on his knees, this man she had loved, this man she had trusted with the most courageous version of herself, and she felt something move through her that was beyond anger and beyond grief. It was something quieter and colder and far more final. She spoke 8 words. 8 words that carried the weight of 2 marriages, 2 betrayals, 2 collapsed futures, and one woman who had been through enough to understand exactly what she was looking at. 2 men, 2 betrayals, And the same woman. Miles tried to speak. She shook her head once, slowly, definitively, and she walked to the door, picked up her keys from the hook where she always kept them, and she walked out. No screaming, no slamming door, no dramatic last glance over her shoulder. Just a woman moving through a room with absolute clarity about what needed to happen next, and the steady, quiet strength to do it without performing it for anyone. She got in her car and drove. The city lights of Des Moines blurred through the windshield like a time-lapse film of everything she was leaving behind. She drove with no destination, just movement, just the forward momentum of a woman who wasn't sure yet where she was going, but was absolutely certain of what she was leaving. And the thing that would have surprised you most, if you had been in the passenger seat that night, was not that she was crying. It was that she wasn't. She felt strangely calm, empty in a way that was less like devastation and more like the particular silence after a very long storm. As if her body, having been through this before, had learned how to absorb the impact. As if some deep, cellular part of Imara Hayes already understood that this was not the end of her story, that she had survived the first one and she would survive this one, and that the question was not whether she would get through it, but who she would be on the other side. 2 men, 2 betrayals, and the same woman. Which brings us to the question I need to leave you sitting with, because this is the question that changes everything that comes next. When life hands you the same wound twice, using the same instrument in a different hand, is that coincidence? Is that cruelty? Or is that the universe insisting, at whatever cost, that there is something you have not yet learned? Something about your own patterns, your own worth, your own capacity to recognize yourself clearly enough to protect what matters most. Imara Hayes drove through the Iowa night with no answer, but somewhere in the dark, in the empty passenger seat of that moving car, the answer was already forming itself, and it would change her, completely, permanently, in ways that no betrayal and no amount of heartbreak ever could. So here is the question that has been sitting in the middle of this whole story, waiting to be answered. Not the question of who betrayed whom, or why Layla Morgan kept appearing like a dark thread woven through 2 different tapestries of heartbreak. Not even the question of whether Imara Hayes would ever trust another human being again. The real question, the one that matters, the one that this entire story has been building toward, is this. What does a woman do when she has lost everything twice, and the only thing left standing is herself? Because that is exactly where Imara Hayes found herself on a quiet Iowa morning, some days after driving through the city with blurred lights and empty hands and the strange, hollow calm of someone who has finally stopped being surprised by pain. She woke up. The sunlight came through the window the way it always had, unhurried, indifferent to human suffering, golden and wide over the cornfields that had witnessed every chapter of her life. She lay there for a moment and took inventory. No Malik, no Miles, no ring on her finger, no banner above the window, no red dress hanging on the back of the door. Just Imara, just the room, just the light. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough to begin with. But don't mistake that stillness for peace. Not yet. Because the work that comes after surviving something is rarely as cinematic as the surviving itself. Nobody makes movies about the Tuesday mornings when you have to get up and wash dishes and answer emails and exist in a body that is still carrying the weight of everything that happened to it. Nobody scores those moments with a swelling orchestra. But those moments, those quiet, unwitnessed, deeply unglamorous moments, are where real transformation lives. And Imara Hayes was about to do some of the hardest and most important work of her entire life. And she was going to do it without an audience, without applause, and without any guarantee that it would lead anywhere worth going. She started where she always started, with her hands. The first thing she did, and this was not symbolic at the time, it only became symbolic later, was take everything down. The photographs that lined the hallway of her farmhouse came off the walls one by one. Some were of her and Malik, early years, college days, a trip they'd taken to Chicago that first winter of their marriage, when everything was still luminous with possibility. Some were of her and Miles, a candid shot someone had taken at a gallery event, the 2 of them laughing at something off camera, her head tilted back, his hand at her elbow. She took them all down, not with rage, not with the dramatic energy of someone making a statement, with the quiet, methodical focus of a woman clearing a space she intends to rebuild. She sold the paintings they had bought together. She gave away Malik's old jacket that had somehow stayed in her closet through the divorce, still carrying the shape of shoulders she used to lean against. She found Miles's favorite book on her nightstand, a worn copy of something he'd lent her months ago with a note inside the front cover, and she held it for a moment, not reading the note, just holding it, and then she put it in a box by the door. Each thing she released felt like setting down a stone she hadn't realized she was carrying. And by the time she had moved through every room of that farmhouse with clear eyes and steady hands, she felt lighter in a way that was almost physical. The rooms looked larger. The light came in differently. She stood in the middle of her living room in the midday, quiet, and breathed in, and it was the cleanest breath she had taken in longer than she could remember. Now, here is what I want you to understand about what Imara was doing, because it is easy to read this as a woman erasing her past, and that is not what was happening at all. She was not pretending those years didn't exist. She was not performing a healing she hadn't earned yet. She was doing something far more sophisticated and far more difficult. She was separating herself from the stories that other people's choices had written onto her. She was saying, quietly to no one but herself and those empty rooms, that her walls, her spaces, her life belonged to her, that what hung on them and lived in them should reflect who she was, not who she had been attached to. This is a distinction that takes most people years to arrive at, if they arrive at it at all. She went back to the canvas, and what came out of her brushes in those first weeks was startling, even to her, because it wasn't darkness. After everything, after the motel and the papers and the text message on the coffee table and the drive through the city with blurring lights, after all of that, what emerged from Imara Hayes onto the canvas was light. Bright, open, almost aggressive light. Fields of gold. Dancing figures with their arms thrown wide. Birds mid-flight against an Iowa sky so blue it looked invented. She painted a series of phoenixes, not the tortured, dramatic kind, surrounded by ash and tragedy, but mid-flight phoenixes, already up, already moving, already going somewhere. She titled one-piece sunflowers at dawn and drove it over to her parents' house on a Saturday morning, carrying it up the front porch steps while her mother held the door. She hung it in the living room, stepped back, and looked at it for a long time. Her mother came and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then her mother put an arm around her and said the truest thing anyone had said to Imara in a very long time. "You survived," she said simply. "That's the end of that story." And Imara laughed. Not a performative laugh, not the fragile laugh of someone trying to convince themselves they're okay, a real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere low and certain, from a place that has been through enough to recognize the absurdity of its own survival. She laughed, and her mother laughed, and they stood there in front of sunflowers at dawn in a warm living room in Iowa, and it was one of the best moments of Imara Hayes' entire life. Because in that moment, she was not a woman who had been betrayed. She was not a woman rebuilding from wreckage. She was simply a daughter, standing with her mother, laughing in the particular way that people laugh when they have made it through something they weren't sure they would make it through. Her sister called that evening and said, without preamble and with absolutely zero diplomatic softening, that Malik was still a fool and that she had always thought so. And Imara laughed so hard she spilled her tea. She didn't correct her sister. She didn't defend Malik or perform generosity toward his memory. She just laughed and agreed, and felt the specific relief of being known by people who have watched you your whole life and love you without conditions or complications. Community, it turns out, is its own kind of medicine. And Imara had been underdosing on it. Tamika arrived the following weekend with the particular energy she always carried, loud, warm, opinionated, unstoppable, and announced without asking that she had signed both of them up for a pottery class at the community center, starting the following Tuesday. Imara opened her mouth to object, and Tamika held up one hand in the universal gesture of absolute non-negotiation. And that was that. Tuesday came. They sat at long tables in a community center room that smelled of wet earth and old coffee, surrounded by strangers in aprons, and they put their hands into clay and tried to make things. Imara's first attempt at a bowl was, by any objective measure, a disaster. lopsided, thin on one side, with a wobbling base that seemed uncertain about its own existence. The instructor came by, looked at it, tilted her head, and said, "Keep going. The imperfect ones have the most character." Tamika looked at Imara over the top of her own equally lopsided creation, and they both started laughing until the people at the next table turned to look. But here is what that lopsided bowl gave Imara that she hadn't expected. It reminded her that she could make something with her hands, and it didn't have to be perfect to be worth making. It reminded her that the process of creating, the physical, sensory, present tense act of putting your hands into something and shaping it, was itself the point, not the finished object. She had known this about painting for years, but painting had become so bound up in her pain that she had forgotten it applied to the rest of her life too, to her mornings, to her choices, to the daily, ordinary, unremarkable act of simply being a person in the world and making the next right move. She kept going back. Every Tuesday, she made mugs that leaned slightly to the left, and bowls with uneven rims, and one vase that she secretly loved more than anything she had ever made in a studio, because it looked like something that had survived something. The mornings changed too. Slowly, the way seasons change in Iowa, not all at once, but in incremental shifts that you only notice when you look back. She started running, not because running was going to fix anything, and not because she had some goal in mind, but because she needed to be in her body in a way that was uncomplicated and demanding and completely her own. The first few runs were hard in the particular way that starting anything new is hard. Her lungs protested, her legs complained, and the only thing that kept her moving was the stubborn refusal to stop. But she ran through the fields as the sun came up, and she noticed things she had been moving through too quickly to see. The exact color of the sky at 6 in the morning before anyone else was awake. The way the corn looked in the early light, silver-tipped and rustling in a breeze that was too faint to feel on your face, but strong enough to move a whole field. The sound of her own breathing, steady and rhythmic, the most honest sound in the world. She would stop sometimes, halfway through a run, and just stand in the middle of a dirt path between two fields and look at the horizon. Iowa's horizon is something you have to have lived with to fully understand. It is enormous and quiet and completely without ego. It doesn't ask anything of you. It just extends endlessly in all directions, reminding you that the world is far larger than whatever is currently breaking your heart. Standing out there in the morning quiet, feeling the breeze on her face and her heart rate slowing back to normal, Imara Hayes would remind herself of a single thing. She was alive. She was here. And that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. She sold another painting called Phoenix at an art center show in the spring. The buyer was a retired schoolteacher from Ames who had driven 2 hours to attend the show, and she stood in front of the painting for a very long time before she found Imara, and told her, with a directness that people of a certain age carry like a superpower, that she saw hope in it. Real hope, she said. Not the wishful kind, the earned kind. Imara looked at her for a moment. "I think you might be right," she said. And she meant it in a way she hadn't the first time she'd said those words, after the first Phoenix painting, after the first recovery. This time, the hope didn't feel like something she was reaching toward. It felt like something she was standing inside of. Spring arrived in Iowa the way it always does, tentatively at first, then all at once, a sudden explosion of green after months of bare fields and grey skies. Imara opened her windows. She planted tomatoes in the garden behind the farmhouse, something she had never done before, because she had always been too busy or too distracted or simply too tethered to another person's idea of what their shared life should look like, to do something as quietly personal as growing her own food. She watered them every morning before her run and checked on them every evening, and there was something in watching those small plants push up through the dark soil that felt deeply and privately satisfying in a way she didn't try to analyze or explain. She hosted a backyard barbecue in May. Just friends and family, Tamika, her sister, her parents, a few people from the art community who had shown up for her during the hard months with soup and presents, and no requirement that she be anything other than exactly what she was. They grilled corn. They told stories. Her father burned the chicken. the way he always did, and everyone pretended not to notice, the way they always did, and the evening smelled of smoke and laughter and cut grass and the particular warmth of people who have chosen each other and keep choosing each other. Imara sat in a folding chair in her own backyard with a cold drink in her hand and looked around at the faces of the people who loved her and felt something so simple and so complete that she almost didn't have a word for it. Gratitude, she realized. That was the word, not the performative kind, not the kind you announce or post about or use as a caption, the quiet, cellular kind, the kind that settles into you when you have been through enough to understand exactly what you are grateful for and why. She tried online dating for approximately 2 weeks sometime in the summer, not because she was ready, but because Tamika had suggested it with such earnest enthusiasm that it seemed worth a look. She swiped through profiles on a rainy Thursday evening with a cup of tea and her cat, and she swiped left on almost everything, not with bitterness but with clarity, the clear-eyed, unhurried clarity of someone who knows what she's not ready for and feels no shame in that knowledge. She deleted the app after 12 days. It hadn't been a failure. It had been a data point. It told her something useful about herself, that she was doing fine on her own, and that fine was something she had once taken for granted and now recognized as the genuinely valuable thing it was. She was not closing her heart. She was not deciding never to love again. She had been through enough to know that declarations like that are just fear wearing the costume of wisdom. No, what Imara Hayes was doing was something quieter and harder and more honest than that. She was learning how to be the primary love of her own life. She was learning how to come home to herself at the end of the day and feel the satisfaction of her own company. She was learning that the love that lasts, the love that cannot be taken from you by any betrayal or any broken promise or any text message from any L. Morgan, that love begins with you. It always has. It always will. And that understanding, once it arrives, changes the shape of everything. Her art evolved in ways that surprised her. She started a new series she called Iowa Women, large-scale portraits of ordinary women in extraordinary ordinary moments. A farmer checking her crops at dusk, a grandmother teaching a granddaughter to make pie crust in a kitchen full of flour and afternoon light. A young black girl standing at the edge of a cornfield with her face turned toward the sun, in an expression that was not quite defiance and not quite joy, but something in between, something that Imara recognized from the inside because she had been wearing that expression her whole life without knowing it had a name. The series got attention. A curator from a gallery in Chicago reached out about a possible show. A journalist from a Des Moines publication wanted to do a profile. Imara agreed to the profile and declined the Chicago show, not because she wasn't ready, but because she was doing something she had never done before, choosing at her own pace, on her own terms, without urgency, and without the feeling that she needed to justify her choices to anyone. She was, for the first time in her adult life, entirely her own. On a morning in early autumn, Imara Hayes woke before the alarm. The light was doing what autumn light in Iowa does, slanting in low and golden, casting long shadows, making everything look slightly more significant than it does in summer. She lay there for a moment in that particular warmth and took inventory, the way she had taken inventory on that first morning after miles. But this inventory felt different. This wasn't the hollow counting of what was missing. This was something fuller and more grounded. She had her art. She had her community. She had her morning runs and her lopsided mugs and her tomatoes, which had, against all expectation, actually produced tomatoes. She had her parents' living room with sunflowers at dawn on the wall. She had Tamika's stubbornness and her sister's jokes and her father's reliably burned chicken. She had scars, yes, real ones, not metaphorical. The kind that pulls slightly when you reach for certain things and remind you, quietly but persistently, of what they cost. But scars are not the same as wounds. Wounds are open. Wounds are vulnerable and raw, and in the process of deciding what they will become. Scars have already decided. Scars are proof that the body, that the person, made it through. She got up. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the cornfields in the early light, and she thought about everything that window had witnessed. The morning she hung an anniversary banner. The night she came home from a motel parking lot, and sat in the dark waiting for a man who didn't deserve her patience. The months of solitude, the season of miles, the long, quiet, necessary work of becoming someone she could trust. She picked up her coffee and turned away from the window. She had a canvas waiting, and that, in the end, is the real story. Not the betrayals, as dramatic and devastating as they were. Not the men, either of them. Not even the specific details of what Layla Morgan said or did, or why she appeared twice in the same story, like a symbol the universe couldn't stop reaching for. The real story is this woman, at this window, on this morning, turning toward her work with the steady confidence of someone who has learned, at considerable cost and with considerable grace, that she is the most important relationship of her own life. Imara Hayes walked away from 2 burning buildings. She built something with the ash, and she did it in Iowa, in the quiet and the wide open and the golden morning light, with paint on her hands, and laughter with her sister, and lopsided mugs and sunflowers on her parents' wall, and a hope that was not wishful but earned, the real kind, the lasting kind, the kind that lives not in another person, but in the way you show up for yourself every ordinary, extraordinary morning of your one irreplaceable life. Here is what I want to leave you with. Not as a lesson because you are not a student and this is not a lecture, but as something to carry with you when you walk away from this story. Every single person watching this right now has a version of that farmhouse window, a moment, or a chapter, or a season of their life when everything they thought was permanent turned out to be temporary, when the people they trusted most showed them something they couldn't unsee. And the question is never whether that happens. The question is always what you do with the morning after, what you build in the cleared space, what you choose to hang on the walls when you take everything else down. Imara chose phoenixes. She chose sunflowers. She chose lopsided mugs and morning runs and the hard, humble daily work of becoming someone whole. What are you choosing? If this story moved you, if something in Imara's journey reflected something in your own, if you recognized yourself anywhere in these 3 acts of heartbreak and healing and hard-won hope, then do something with that recognition right now, while it's still warm in you. Leave a comment below and tell us the moment in this story that hit closest to home. Was it the red dress and the anniversary banner and the particular cruelty of a beautiful morning that doesn't know what it's about to witness? Was it the drive through the city with the blurred lights, the eerie calm of someone who has survived something so completely that there are no tears left for it? Was it the lopsided bowl, the pottery class, the small and unglamorous and deeply real work of rebuilding a life from the inside out? Tell us. Because your story matters too, and this community was built for exactly that kind of honesty. And if you know someone who is sitting in the middle of their own act too right now, someone who followed their own version of those taillights to their own version of a motel parking lot and is still trying to figure out how to get from that moment to the morning where they stand at the window and feel okay, share this story with them. Not because it has all the answers, but because sometimes the most important thing you can give someone in the middle of their hardest chapter is proof that the story keeps going, that Act 3 exists, that the morning comes. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories where this one came from. True stories about real people navigating the full, complicated, gorgeous, devastating, beautiful mess of American life, told the way they deserve to be told. And hit the notification bell, because you do not want to miss what's coming next. Imara Hayes chose herself. Every morning she keeps choosing. Now it's your turn.